everybody. We're going to finish up this unit with talking about how our body exchanges the gases that are required. Earlier lecture, we talked about the respiratory system, where we learned how we get air from the atmosphere into our lungs. And so now we want to go a step further and find out how we get the oxygen from that air to cross our lung tissue and get into our bloodstream. And then when our bloodstream at our tissues, remember that our tissues make carbon dioxide, and so we want to get the carbon dioxide out of our tissues into our bloodstream and then take that to our lungs so we can exhale it out. So what I just described to you is gas exchange. Okay, and so really it's just a simple diffusion of these gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, down what's called their partial pressure gradients. And if I can hit the next, there we go, I did it. Yeah, so what do I mean by partial pressure gradients? Well, we talked about already how gases move from the area of high pressure to low, and we saw that gases create a pressure because the molecules are bouncing off of each other, and that is what's creating pressure. Well, partial pressure refers to the individual gases in that mixture. Okay, and each individual gas exerts its own pressure. Okay, and so the gas will then move based on its own pressure gradient. That's how oxygen can move from the lungs into the blood, and CO2 can move out of the blood into the lungs all at the same time. Okay, so this is an idea by what's called Dalton's law. So Dalton's law says that the total pressure of a gas is equal to the sum of each of its partial pressures. So if you look at this picture here, let me turn on my laser. Looking at this picture, you know, this is representing total atmospheric pressure. And now we're only showing two types of molecules that are in the atmosphere. But what this does show us is that, and you can see down here, the atmosphere is made out of more than just oxygen. It's actually, there's nitrogen gas there, there's carbon dioxide, there's water, there's other things as well. But this is what makes up most of the gases in our atmosphere. And they come in different quantities. So oxygen, the quantity of oxygen in the atmosphere is about 21% of the total atmosphere. Nitrogen is about 79%. Okay, and so on and so forth. So how can what we know is that at sea level, the total atmospheric pressure produced by all of the gases in the atmosphere is 760 millimeters of mercury, right? And so to find the partial pressures of that, you can, since nitrogen makes up 79% of the total atmosphere, you can just multiply 760 times 0.79. So nitrogen's partial pressure is 600 millimeters of mercury. So again, that means in the total atmospheric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, then 600 millimeters of mercury of that is coming from the pressure of nitrogen. Well, we don't really use nitrogen in our body. We have to rely on plants to get a source of nitrogen. We can't use it in this form. But what we do use is the oxygen. And so we do use the oxygen in its O2 form. So we want to know the partial pressure of oxygen. So we just do the same method. We're at sea level, and we're going to assume in most of our calculations here that we're at sea level. So we know that oxygen is 21% of the 760. So just like before, we just take 760, multiply that by 0.21, and that tells us that the partial pressure of oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and we can keep using that method to determine the partial pressures of all the gases in the atmosphere. But we're going to stick with what we know about oxygen. That's the main one that we're going to talk about today. Later on, I'll mention the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay, so here's the idea. Now, we talked about the total pressure during respiration, during ventilation, meaning getting atmospheric air from the atmosphere into our lungs. That was ventilation. So there is where we looked at total atmospheric pressure compared to the total pressure in our lungs. But for gas exchange, we're just concerned about how does oxygen move across, diffuse across membranes, and how does CO2 diffuse across membranes. And so now we're going to be concerned just about its partial pressures. And so don't let this slide be confusing to you. There's a lot of information on here. I just want to use this to illustrate to you what we were just talking about. So what we're going to see as we go through these steps, basically there's two areas. Again, I'm pausing when I see my internet is unstable. There's two areas of gas exchange. So one occurs at the pulmonary circuit up here. So that's when blood is coming from the right side of our body, and we call it deoxygenated because this is the venous return. So that means this blood has already been to all of our tissues where it released oxygen, but it didn't release all of its oxygen. There's always some oxygen in here, and you can see it comes in at a partial pressure of 40. Okay, but this is a site of exchange. We've inhaled some air, and so what we're going to be concerned about is how does that oxygen then diffuse from the alveoli into the bloodstream. The venous blood is also carrying carbon dioxide. So how does that carbon dioxide fuse out of the capillary? So that's one side of gas exchange. The other side of gas exchange takes place in the systemic system. And so now we have our cells that need oxygen, that are using oxygen. So we're going to see oxygen in the capillaries diffuse across those membranes and get into the tissues. And our tissues are doing work, and so remember, CO2 is a waste product of cellular respiration. So we want that CO2 to leave the tissues and go into the bloodstream. Okay, so two sites of gas exchange occurring, the pulmonary circuit and then in the systemic circuit. Okay, and so this is what we were talking about here. So what I did is I made a little cartoon picture here to represent the big pink bubble is like your lungs. That would really be one alveolus. And then this is a capillary bed coming through. And so you can see that when out in the atmosphere, when we inhale air, that the partial pressure of the oxygen in the air is 160 millimeters of mercury. And there is CO2 in the atmosphere, but that's only 0.23 millimeters of mercury. Very little out there. Remember back from general biology, plants use CO2. So plants are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to make glucose during photosynthesis. And the waste product they release is oxygen. And then we do the reverse. We use oxygen, we release CO2. Okay, so when we inhale, all of that, this tube here would represent this tube here represents our trachea and our bronchi, and then our bronchioles, right? So that's what that's representing. So by the time the atmospheric air goes through all of those tubes, by the time we lose a little bit of pressure along the way, okay? And so by the time the air gets into our lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury. I took off the units because we're going to assume millimeters of mercury here. So let's just follow the oxygen. So now we have a partial pressure of oxygen in here at 100 millimeters of mercury. So notice this is the venous blood. This is the blood coming from the right side of the heart, okay, through our pulmonary arteries and then into the pulmonary capillaries that are surrounding each alveolus. And remember that this blood has been by our tissues and released oxygen. And when we do, and this is a body at rest, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that means by the time this blood comes around to our capillaries in our lungs, you have a partial pressure gradient, right? So if you have 100 millimeters of mercury at the lungs and the blood right next to it is only at 40, that means oxygen is going to, by simple diffusion, just diffuse across the membranes of the alveoli, diffuse across the membranes of the capillary. And now the blood, as it's moving around the lungs and heading to the left side of the heart, it's going to diffuse across until it equilibrates at a partial pressure of 100. Right? So all of this time it's taking in oxygen. And so because of that partial pressure gradient of 100 to 40, by the time that blood leaves the lungs, then the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay? The opposite occurs is now that the blood coming from the right side of the heart has more carbon dioxide in it at 46. By the time it moves, there's a pressure gradient there. In the lungs, it's about 40 because it's picking up CO2 along the way. And so it's about 40. So there's a gradient. It's still a gradient from 46 to 40. Okay, and so when it releases it and until it equilibrates. So the partial pressure of CO2, by the time it gets back into our arteries, or it gets back into the circulation that's going to go to the left side of the heart, it's about a partial pressure of 40. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with gas exchange. So again, it has more to do with the way that oxygen diffuses across does not have anything to do with the pressure of CO2 and vice versa. So when you're talking about partial pressures and whether a molecule will diffuse across, you want to look at its own partial pressure. Okay. So factors that can affect the rate of this transfer, number one is what we just talked about, the partial pressure. Number two, it has to do with the surface area of the exchange membrane, right? So remember we talked about in the lungs that our alveoli they've been constructed, the lung tissue, instead of being just a flat membrane for gas exchange to occur, it actually formed these little sacs of alveoli. So that's folding up the tissues, creating more tissue within that small space inside of our chest cavity. Okay, so that's how we increase surface area. The more surface area there is, the more area there is for the exchange to take place. Okay, the thickness of the barrier can also affect how quickly gases diffuse across, right? And so both the alveoli and the capillaries are both made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Let me pop ahead. I can't remember. No, so I don't really have a good picture of that. Let me go back here. So basically, the membrane of the alveolus, right here, this is simple squamous, right? And then there's the membrane of the capillaries. Remember, that's simple squamous epithelial tissue. And if you recall from anatomy, epithelial tissue all has a basement membrane. Well, between the alveoli and the capillaries, that basement membrane is fused. So that means, I mean, this cartoon makes it look big, but that's actually the smallest diffusional distance that we have in our bodies. So it's really important for gas exchange to take place. And then the other one is the diffusion constant, which we're not really going to get into in this class, but just suffices to say that each molecule has its own diffusion constant. And what that means is just, in a nutshell, it's related to the properties of the molecule that affects its diffusion rate, coupled with the pressure gradient as well. So don't worry too much about the diffusion constant. You need to understand pressure, surface area, and the thickness of the exchange barrier, how that all can affect the rate of transfer for gases. Okay, so that's what happened up at the pulmonary circuit between the alveoli and the capillaries. Now you got to imagine the blood is flowing around and coming to, let me show you back here. So we just saw what happens here, and you see those numbers. Okay, now we're going around the left side. Now we're in the systemic circuit, and you can see that the arteries are bringing the blood that just came from the lungs. And so the partial pressure of oxygen as it comes into the capillaries of at our different organs is going to be about 100, and the partial pressure of CO2 is going to be about 40. Right? And so then we're going to look at a little more closely at what's happening at the exchange now at the tissues. And that's what we see here, as if we blew it up for you. So here are the orange cells. These are with the big blue nuclei. So these are like your tissues. This is a certain organ doing work. Here's the interstitial fluid. And then here is the capillary. We're inside of a capillary. You can see the simple squamous cells that make up the wall of the capillary, and we have a red blood cell here, and this is plasma all around here. So the direction of the blood flow, the blood is coming up from the bottom of the screen and heading toward the top of the screen. So again, what we're concerned about are the partial pressure gradients. So we know that our tissues need oxygen, right? And our blood is carrying a lot of oxygen. Now we're going to talk about what's happening inside of the red blood cell in just a minute. Okay, but the partial pressure of oxygen within the whole blood itself, and here I wrote it down in the plasma, again, is about 100. The tissues are doing work and they're using that oxygen. Remember, it's going into the mitochondrion, and when it's being used there during cellular respiration at the end of the electron transport chain, the oxygen is collecting electrons and hydrogens becomes water. Right, so therefore we're using the oxygen, and so the pressure down at the tissues is about 40. Hey, look at that, a concentration gradient, or I should say a pressure gradient, a partial pressure gradient. So the oxygen is going to move out of the blood and move into the tissues. And we'll see that it actually detaches from the hemoglobin in a red blood cell and moves into the plasma, which then it moves out of the plasma into our tissues. So there's always a concentration gradient at the tissues of moving oxygen from the blood into the tissues. Now the opposite is occurring here. So during that cellular respiration, processes are, remember the waste product is making is CO2. Remember that happens in the preparatory phase, and then also in the Krebs cycle, CO2 is building up. So here you can see the partial pressure of CO2 is 46, but the partial pressure of CO2 as it was coming from our systemic system, coming from the heart, is 40. So therefore, that's a gradient, a partial pressure gradient. So CO2 is going to move across from the cell into the interstitial fluid, and from the interstitial fluid into the plasma until the partial pressure equilibrates. Okay, but so remember though, this blood keeps moving. So as the blood keeps driving forward, we keep bringing in a partial pressure of 40 again. So we can have a continuous flow of CO2 from the cells into the blood, and vice versa. We can have a continuous flow of oxygen from the blood into the cells. Okay, now, so one thing we have to consider, however, is that that oxygen does not dissolve in plasma very well. In fact, as soon as the oxygen starts to dissolve in plasma, the partial pressure of plasma, or the partial pressure of oxygen in the plasma goes up. Okay, and so to keep the partial pressure down a little lower so that we can pack the blood with as much oxygen as possible, what we do is we store oxygen inside of the red blood cell. Okay, and so by pulling oxygen out of the plasma into the red blood cell, then that makes the partial pressure gradient lower in the plasma. What it means is we can actually carry more oxygen before the partial pressure increases too quickly. So how do we do that? We do that through the red blood cell. Remember, we learned earlier that it's packed with a protein molecule called hemoglobin. Okay, so most of the oxygen that travels through the blood is attached to hemoglobin. And that's what you can see in this table right here. Don't ignore carbon dioxide for just a moment. We'll get to that later. So you can see out of all the oxygen that we transport in the blood, 98.5% of it is actually carried in the red blood cell by the bound to hemoglobin. Only 1.5% of it is actually dissolved in the plasma. Okay? And so, so we can look, what happens is when hemoglobin is just is any oxygen, we call that reduced hemoglobin, or sometimes it's called deoxyhemoglobin. Okay, but it has a high affinity to oxygen, so it will bind, and when it does, we might call it this, HB is hemoglobin with the O2. That means the oxygen is bound to it. So now we call that hemoglobin oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. So just to remind you, one hemoglobin molecule is made out of the 4 polypeptide chains, and within each polypeptide chain is the heme group, right? So there's 1 per each. So each hemoglobin is carrying 4 heme groups, and it's in the ferrous ion or the iron ion, that's a 2+. That's where oxygen binds to, right in the middle of that heme group. Okay, so oxygen binds to the iron ion, and we set up that it binds reversibly. So again, that means we want to carry oxygen in its O2 form. That's how it exists in the atmosphere. And so when it binds, okay, it's still in its O2 form. Then when hemoglobin releases it, it will still remain in its O2 form. Oftentimes when molecules come together and they bind and then they release, oftentimes one or the other molecule will take electrons and things like this. But this doesn't happen here. So we say that hemoglobin binds reversibly. So now we want to find out, well, why does it bind up at the lungs? And why does it release oxygen at your tissues? Okay. Well, first of all, let's look at how why hemoglobin is very important in keeping the partial pressure of oxygen low in the plasma. Okay, so it does this, like I said, so we can actually carry more oxygen. We end up carrying more oxygen while keeping the partial pressure of the plasma low, so we can continue the diffusion from the alveoli into the bloodstream. So let's imagine just for a minute in this first panel. So here we are in an alveolus. It's actually showing the whole lungs, but imagine this is one alveolus here. Here's oxygen molecules bouncing around in there. Okay, and now here's a blood capillary, and let's pretend we didn't have any red blood cells. That's what we're seeing here. So so what's going to happen is oxygen is going to diffuse across until the partial pressures equilibrate. Okay, so let's imagine we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 oxygen molecules are in the lungs, and so oxygen's going to keep moving across until it equilibrates. So that's what we have here. Now we have 8 oxygen molecules in the plasma. And so that means that the blood right here cannot absorb any more oxygen. It can't. It does it until it's equal to one another. So I'm using absolute numbers, but again, what we're really talking about is pressure. But it's easier to understand with absolute numbers. Okay, now imagine, okay, now we have red blood cells. Yay, and our red blood cells have hemoglobin. And so just for illustration's sake, to keep it simple, let's, our red blood cell, we're gonna say, because hemoglobin can bind to up to 4 oxygen, right? That's what we saw here. 1 molecule of hemoglobin can bind up to 4 oxygen. Let's just illustrate it that way. So here we have 3 red blood cells, so each one can bind oxygen. So what would happen is that as these oxygens are diffusing across the membrane to get into the capillary, into the plasma, it gets attracted right away into the red blood cell where the hemoglobin binds it. So now this molecule is not in the plasma, so it's not contributing to partial pressure. That keeps the partial pressure low. So another one can come, and another one can come, and another one can come. So you can see we've got 12 spaces to fill here. So before, when we were only carrying 8, in the plasma. Now you can see we've got 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, but we still have spaces for 6 more, right? And that's what happens. So the oxygen that's still up in here can continue to move across. And so now we're actually carrying 12, 14 molecules of oxygen, compared to if we didn't have red blood cells, the plasma could only handle about 8. Okay, and in truth, these two would also probably diffuse across, because again, we're pulling the pressure out of the plasma by storing, we're keeping it low in the plasma by storing it in the red blood cells. So now we're carrying more. When hemoglobin has all of its sites bound, we call the blood cell then fully saturated. Okay. When only some of the sites are bound, then we say that it's partly saturated hemoglobin molecule. Okay, and one thing to just remember back from the lecture on blood, when we looked a little more closely at hemoglobin, is that one hemoglobin molecule, we said, can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And there are about 280 million hemoglobin molecules in one red blood cell. So that means one red blood cell can carry over 1 billion oxygen molecules. So we're able to carry a lot because of hemoglobin in red blood cells. Okay, so again, the whole point of having hemoglobin is that this is how we're able to continue with diffusion. You can see without the red blood cells, diffusion would stop pretty quickly. This is saturated. Okay, the partial pressures are saturated. But because we have red blood cells, the diffusion, simple diffusion of oxygen from our lungs into our blood can continue, right? And then therefore we can carry more oxygen as it sweeps on and heads into the systemic system. Okay, so you want to be able to make sure you can explain the importance of hemoglobin in keeping the partial pressure of oxygen low in the plasma. Okay, so again, the partial pressure of oxygen, this is the main factor in determining the percentage of hemoglobin saturation. So what does this mean? Because we said that hemoglobin will bind to oxygen sometimes, and then it will release oxygen at other times. So why? Well, at our lungs, right, the partial pressure of oxygen is high from our lungs to our bloodstream, right? So hemoglobin then has a high affinity to bind oxygen. Okay, so the percent saturation therefore is high. When we move to the systemic system, the pressure of oxygen outside of the bloodstream is low, right? So that facilitates the release of oxygen off of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin wants to dissociate from oxygen, okay? So that it loses its affinity to oxygen when the partial pressure changes. Okay, so again, at the lungs, the partial pressure is high from the lungs to the blood. So there's a affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. So we get the binding of oxygen, and therefore we get oxyhemoglobin. When we get the blood courses around to the capillaries where our tissues are, the partial pressure of oxygen at the tissues is low. So that facilitates the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Okay, and so we reduce hemoglobin and oxygen moves into the tissues. So this relationship is what's known as the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So warning, you have some graphs you're going to look at that you're going to need to be able to interpret. Okay, and here we go. So here's a nice graph. This is called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, so let's break this down. We've got our y-axis and our x-axis. So along the x-axis is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, okay, by millimeters of mercury. So it goes from 0 to 100, okay? And up along the y-axis, we have the percent hemoglobin saturation, Okay, percent hemoglobin saturation. Don't worry about this axis over here right now, the volume percentage of oxygen in the blood. We're not going to worry about that right now. Okay, well, we just said a couple of things when you look at the x-axis. Remember what we said, that the blood, I'm going to go back, right? At our lungs, the percent saturation is 100, or the partial pressure of oxygen is 100. And so that's what it is when it gets into our systemic system in our arteries. It's 100. Remember, we saw that also here. This is the partial pressure of oxygen coming through the direction of blood flow. So this is coming from the left side of the heart. Okay, so it's 100. Hey, look at this. Here's the partial pressure of 100, and there is a line there showing that this is normal partial pressure at the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, and again, within our systemic system. Okay, so the way we read this is that when we go across to the y-axis, we see that the percent hemoglobin saturation when we're at 100 millimeters of mercury is really close to 100%. So that means it's fully oxygenated. The hemoglobin is fully oxygenated. Okay, we never reached completely 100%. It's usually like 98, 99. Okay, but you can call it 100%. So again, what this is saying is that at our arteries, or once the blood leaves our pulmonary capillaries, the hemoglobin, what is the percent saturation? Well, you look at the graph. So we go 100. This curve will always be here. So this is showing you what where the values fall on the curve. So when we stop at 100, we go up to the red line to the curve. That's where we stop. Now we can go across and we say, so the percent saturation of hemoglobin is about 100%. Okay, well now when the blood is traveling to our tissues, remember that our tissues, or the venule side, the partial pressure is 40. Remember that? We saw that right here. Whoops, one more. Takes a while for the, I think there it goes, caught up. Remember, the partial pressure is 40. Okay, so if I want to know what's the percent saturation of hemoglobin when the partial pressure is 40, that tells me what I'm saying when it's at 40, because I want to know what it is at the tissues. Okay, so we look down here on the x-axis, we go down to 40. And what I want to do is follow a line up until we hit the red curve right there. So the percent, if I'm careful, I go right about there. It's about midway between 70 and 80. So that tells me when the partial pressure of oxygen is at 40 down at the tissues, then hemoglobin is releasing its oxygen, and it's going to be about 75% saturated. 75% saturated. So if it's 75% saturated, that means it released 25% of its oxygen. It released 25%. Okay. That's what's left over. If we keep going down further, let's say you're working really hard and your tissues are using a lot more oxygen. Okay. And so that means that the tissues, the partial pressure is down to 20 now. What is the percent saturation of hemoglobin when the partial pressure of oxygen is at 20? So I'm at 20, I'm gonna go up until I hit the red line, boom, I hit it. Now I look across to the y-axis right there. It is 25% saturated. That's what this one is showing you. That means it released, boom, 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 75% of its oxygen to the tissues so the tissues can use it up. So lower down here, this shows me very active organs, active tissues. Up here, this is either leaving the pulmonary circuit, or the tissues aren't working very much at all. Well, our tissues are always working. At rest, it's always at about 40. Okay, so this is the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, or sometimes we just say oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So rewind this, look at it again so you can see how to read the graph. Okay, Because, let's see, so that's how this transfer works. Let me just tie this together for you now. So this is why at the lungs, that pressure we said, that pressure gradient, the partial pressure gradient, hemoglobin is attracted to oxygen and it binds it. Okay, down at the tissues, the pressure gradient switched. Down at the tissues, it's a lower partial pressure gradient, so hemoglobin releases its oxygen. Okay. Now, other things can affect the curve as well, because so the curve can actually shift. So the red line here is the nerve that we just saw up here. Okay, this is the same curve. Okay, and so again, how can I prove it? At 100, I go up to the red line and the oxygen saturation, hemoglobin saturation is at almost 100. Okay, here we are at 40. I'm gonna head up to about there and I go across. And so at a partial pressure of 40, which tells me that's down at the tissues, right? Our partial pressure, our percent saturation of hemoglobin is 75%. That means the hemoglobin now is only holding 75% of oxygen that it normally could hold. That means it released 25%, right? So if it's holding 75% now, that means it let go of 25% at that tissue, okay? Here again, under normal circumstances, if the partial pressure of oxygen is down at 20, right? Now we see its percent saturation of the hemoglobin is only 25%. So it released 75%. So what's left in the hemoglobin is only 25%. That means the tissues got 75%. Okay, so things can occur. So let's say if your tissues are really working hard and they're pumping out more CO2, the partial pressure of CO2 can increase. That actually shifts the curve, okay? And so shifting of the curve means more oxygen is going to get released, right? So this curve went downward. So remember, the curve represents how much oxygen the hemoglobin is still retaining. Percent saturation, the hemoglobin is saturated, right? So this means that when tissues are working really hard, when the partial pressure goes up, then hemoglobin will automatically release more oxygen, okay? And so let's say now at your tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is still 40, but it's working and it's pumping out more CO2 all of a sudden. Well, the curve shifts. Whereas before in a normal situation, it would release 25% and hold on to 75%. Well, now it's going to release 35% because this says my saturation is 65%. And you're going, wait a minute, but you said that the partial pressure of CO2 and oxygen don't influence each other. Well, this is an indirect influence because when more CO2 gets put into the bloodstream, which is mostly water, what'll happen is it will cause the blood to become more acidic. There it is, high acidity, right? High acidity also pulls the curve down in this direction. So therefore, again, at the same partial pressure of oxygen, it's actually going to release more oxygen because the acidity changed, and that's because the CO2 changed, okay? Acidity doesn't always change just because of CO2. So acidity can change for other reasons, but CO2 does affect acidity, and I'm going to show you that in a minute of how it does that. Okay, so why is that happening? We'll go back to general bio. Remember, you learned mostly about enzymes and how enzymes function more better at certain temperature and certain pH. Right? And remember when we said when the pH became more acidic, when the pH lowered, that means it's more acidic, that it denatured that enzyme protein, okay? Well, hemoglobin is a protein. It's not an enzyme, but it is a protein. All proteins get denatured at particular temperatures and at particular pH. And so that's what's happening here. It doesn't completely denature it with this change in acidity, but all of a sudden the protein molecules change a little bit and oxygen pops off, more oxygen pops off. That's what's happening here. Because look, increase in temperature. Uh-oh, if you increase in temperature, that also decreases the curve. But what does temperature mean? Always go back metabolically, okay? If the temperature is increasing, why is it happening? Because the tissues are working harder because they're making more energy. Remember, every time we transfer energy from one form to another, like glucose and all its steps it gets converted to before it becomes ATP, it loses energy as heat, right? So when your organs are working hard, it's actually warming up in that area because of the heat loss, okay? So that's a signal that the cells are working harder. So if they're making more energy, that means they need more oxygen to do that. Okay, so temperature increase will also cause more oxygen to be released than in a normal situation. Okay, so this last one has to do with, this is one of the intermediaries in cell respiration, right, during glycolysis. So when this when this starts to build up, this intermediate molecule from reorganizing glucose, remember that? If that's building up, that means that glycolysis is going even more, which might mean that the cell is working more anaerobically than it is aerobically. So when this builds up, hemoglobin loses its affinity to oxygen and therefore it releases more. So that's the whole reason why, several reasons why this curve shifts. So I want you to be able to relate what each of these conditions means. It means that there's a rise in metabolism, right? Metabolism, again, are all the chemical reactions that are occurring in a cell. So if metabolism increases, that means the cells are working harder. So, right? So when the cells are working harder, more CO2 gets released. CO2 can cause more acid to be released. Okay. If a cell is doing more metabolism, that means it's releasing more heat. And with more metabolism and it's using all the oxygen, it might be doing more glycolysis. And so you see this molecule raise. All of these things point to the cell needs more oxygen to do the increased work that it's doing. Okay, so you're going to need to be able to read a graph like this. I might ask you, what is the partial pressure of oxygen at the arteries? And so you need to remember that's 100. Okay, and then what is the percent saturation at the arteries? And so you would have to go to 100 and the curve will be there, and you'll have to go to the appropriate curve and say, oh, it's on this one, it's almost 100%, right? What is the normal percent or partial pressure of oxygen at the tissues or at the venous end? And you tell me 40. Okay, then I'm going to ask you, well, what's the percent saturation of hemoglobin at 40? And then you've got to go up, up, up until you hit the curve, boom, right there. That one's 75. Okay, I could ask you any one of these. What if the partial pressure is 50? And you should go up, 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 up. Oh, now it's about 85. Okay, so you do need to be able to read the graph like this. Alrighty, I'm going to stop the video right here because the next thing that we'll look at is carbon dioxide. How does carbon dioxide move and how is it stored in the blood? So it's going to be a little bit different than what we saw in with oxygen. So we'll continue with carbon dioxide in part 2. Thanks, everybody.